The basement of 314 Maple Street had always been an enigma, a dark and unyielding space where silence seemed heavier, shadows seemed deeper, and whispers of forgotten things clung to the air. The house itself was old, built in the late 1800s, but it was the basement that seemed much older, as if the earth beneath had always been waiting for the walls to rise around it. When Sarah moved into the house, she wasn't thinking about basements or whispers. She was thinking about starting fresh after a messy divorce, finding peace in a quaint, affordable home in a quiet neighborhood. But the first time she opened the basement door, something about the space felt wrong. The air was dense and cold, not the coolness of a naturally chilly room, but a biting, invasive cold that settled deep in her bones. She told herself it was just her imagination. After all, it was just a basement, right? The first night passed uneventfully. The second night, though, Sarah began to notice sounds. At first it was faint, like a soft thudding coming from below. She reasoned it was probably the old furnace or the water heater. Houses made noises, she reminded herself. But as the days went by, the noises became clearer, almost deliberate. Knocks. 3 in succession, then silence. One night, as she lay in bed scrolling on her phone, she heard it again. 3 sharp knocks. But this time, the noise was followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps dragging slowly across the basement floor. She froze, every muscle in her body tensed, her ears straining against the stillness. It couldn't be an intruder. She had bolted all the doors, checked all the windows. It was just her and the house. The logical explanation? Maybe an animal had gotten in. The next day, armed with a flashlight and a bat, she descended the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was just as she remembered, cluttered with the remnants of the previous owner's life. A rusted bicycle, broken furniture, and a few forgotten boxes. She checked every corner, every shadow, but found nothing. No evidence of rats or raccoons, just that awful, bone-deep chill. Then she noticed it, a faint scratch mark running along the far wall, just above the baseboards. It wasn't there before. She was certain of it. The scratches formed odd, deliberate patterns, almost like symbols, but they were faint, worn into the wood as if they'd been there for decades. She touched the marks lightly, her fingers grazing over them. The moment she did, the flashlight flickered and went out. In total darkness, Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. That's when she heard it again. The footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging footsteps, moving towards her. She couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't think. Her fingers scrambled over the flashlight, smacking it in a panic until it finally blinked back on. The beam of light swept wildly across the room, but there was nothing. The footsteps had stopped. Heart pounding, Sarah bolted back up the stairs and slammed the door shut behind her. She leaned against it, trying to calm the panic clawing at her chest. "It's just an old house," she whispered aloud, trying to convince herself. Just an old house. But in her heart, she knew something was wrong. That night, she dreamed of the basement. In her dream, the walls were alive, moving and pulsing as if they were breathing. A figure stood in the corner, shrouded in shadow. It didn't move, but she could feel its eyes on her, unblinking and malevolent. When she woke up, her sheets were damp with sweat, and her hands were shaking. She decided to avoid the basement altogether. Days turned into weeks, and though she tried to carry on as normal, the sounds continued. Sometimes it was knocking, other times it was faint whispers that seemed to come from just beneath the floorboards. And sometimes in the dead of night she thought she could hear her name being called in a voice that was almost, but not quite, human. One evening, Sarah returned home to find the basement door standing open. She stared at it, her heart hammering. She hadn't opened it. She was sure of that. Summoning every ounce of courage, she approached the doorway and peered down. At first, it looked normal, dark and still, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The symbols, the ones she had seen faintly scratched into the wall, were now glowing faintly, an eerie, pulsating light that seemed to breathe. And then she saw them. Handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the dust-covered stairs. They led up the staircase, stopping just short of where she stood. Sarah didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she called a friend, begging for help. Her friend Lisa arrived an hour later, skeptical but willing to humor her. Together, they ventured into the basement. To Sarah's horror, the symbols were gone, the handprints were gone, the space was empty, as if mocking her. That night, Sarah heard Lisa scream from the guest room. She rushed in, finding her friend sitting upright, shaking, her face pale as death. "There's something in the basement," Lisa whispered. It wants you. The next day, Sarah packed her bags and left the house. She never returned, leaving behind the mortgage, the furniture, and every unanswered question. The house remains unsold to this day, and neighbors still report strange sounds coming from the basement. But no one dares go inside. Not anymore. On the outskirts of a forgotten town sat an old house, notorious among locals for its cursed past. The legend was simple. No one who stayed in the house ever left the same. The heart of its infamy was the basement, a place that seemed to devour light and chill the air, even in the height of summer. This was the house Emma inherited after her estranged grandmother passed away. Emma wasn't superstitious. She had lived in cities where strange noises came from thin walls, not ghosts. But from the moment she stepped into the house, she felt a wrongness settle over her like a damp fog. The air was heavy, metallic. The boards groaned not just with age, but as though they resented her presence. She wasn't planning to stay long, just enough to clear the place out and put it on the market. On her second day, curiosity got the better of her, and she opened the basement door. A staircase led into darkness, so thick it seemed to absorb the faint bulb's glow. The smell was strange, a mix of earth and something sharper, like burned meat. She hesitated for only a moment before descending. The basement was larger than expected, the walls made of rough stone that seemed older than the house itself. A rusted furnace sat in one corner, and piles of broken furniture littered the room. But what caught her attention was a patch of the floor that was different, an uneven rectangle of stone surrounded by the otherwise dirt floor. It looked like it had been hastily placed to cover something. She crouched, running her hand over the stones. They were cold, unnaturally cold, as if they were drawing heat out of her body. A faint scratching noise echoed from somewhere in the basement, soft but insistent. Emma froze. The noise stopped when she stood. She told herself it was just rats and returned upstairs, but that night, the scratching followed her into her dreams. In the dreams, she was back in the basement, standing over the stone rectangle. Her hands, moving on their own, were scraping at the stones, tearing at them until her nails broke and bled. Beneath the stones was a void, black and endless, and from the void came a voice, a deep, guttural whisper that spoke in no language she understood but filled her with terror. She woke drenched in sweat, the whisper still echoing in her ears. The next day, she couldn't resist. Armed with a crowbar, she went back to the basement. The patch of stone seemed to pulse faintly under the dim light, as if it knew she was coming. With each pried-up stone, the scratching noise grew louder, more frenzied. By the time she removed the last stone, the sound was deafening, a cacophony of nails on stone and whispers that seemed to seep into her mind. Underneath the stones was dirt, black and damp, but the deeper she dug, the more she realized the soil wasn't just dirt. It was warm, wet, and smelled like decay. She gagged, but kept going until her fingers brushed something solid. It was a box, old and wooden, etched with strange swirling symbols. The wood felt alive, pulsing faintly under her touch. As she lifted it from the ground, the lights in the basement flickered and went out. In the pitch black, the scratching noise stopped. What replaced it was worse, breathing, heavy and labored, coming from all around her. She fumbled for her phone's flashlight and turned it on. The beam illuminated the box, now throbbing in her hands, and behind it a figure. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its body was stretched unnaturally, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in jagged claws. Its face was blank, a smooth expanse of pale skin, save for a mouth that stretched wide into a grotesque grin. It didn't move, but seemed to radiate malice, the air around it vibrating with the sound of muffled screams. Emma didn't remember running, only that she found herself outside the house, the box still clutched in her hands. She drove to the nearest motel and spent the night with every light on, the box sitting on the far side of the room, untouched. The following morning, she returned to the house to get her things. She planned to leave for good, but the house seemed different now. The basement door stood open, and from within the whispers were back, louder, more urgent. Emma felt her feet move on their own, carrying her back down the stairs. The basement was alive with sound, the walls seeming to hum with a low, resonant vibration. The box was back where she'd found it, though she was certain she had taken it with her. As she reached for it, the whispers became a roar, deafening and all-consuming. Then the world went dark. Emma was never seen again. The house still stands, its windows blank and lifeless. Those who pass by or they hear whispers coming from the basement, and some say if you stand close enough, you can hear a woman's voice, screaming for help. There's a story people in the small town of Ridgewood like to tell. It's about the house on Willow Lane, the one with the perpetually locked basement. No one knows when the house was built. It doesn't appear in the town's records, and the oldest residents claim it's always been there, standing crooked and dark at the end of the street. When Martin and Clara bought the house, they thought they were getting a bargain. The realtor had mentioned minor quirks, but the couple brushed it off. They loved the charm of the creaky floors and the high ceilings. They loved the backyard that stretched into a thick wall of trees. They did not, however, love the basement. The door to the basement was peculiar, painted black, its handle an old brass knob that was freezing to the touch. The realtor had laughed nervously when asked why it was locked and claimed the key had been lost long ago. Martin joked that they'd eventually break it open, but every time they passed the door, both he and Clara felt a deep unease. It was irrational, they told themselves, but the door stayed locked. It started the third night. Clara woke to a sound she couldn't quite place, a low, rhythmic thumping like someone knocking on wood. She nudged Martin awake, but by the time he was conscious, the sound had stopped. "It's just the house settling," he mumbled, rolling over. The next morning, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It followed her throughout the day as she unpacked boxes, her movements jerky and paranoid, as if something unseen lingered just behind her. That evening, she noticed it, the basement door. It was slightly ajar, the black paint flaking where it had been scratched as if by fingernails. She called Martin, who insisted she must be imagining things. But that night, they both heard it. The thumping was louder now, accompanied by a faint scraping sound, as if something were being dragged across stone. "That's it," Martin said, grabbing a flashlight. "I'm breaking the damn door open." The hinges groaned as he forced it wide, revealing steep wooden stairs descending into darkness. The air that billowed up from below was rancid, a mix of mildew and rot that made Clara gag. Martin shone the flashlight down the stairs, revealing a dirt floor and stone walls. Nothing seemed out of place, just an old basement. "I told you it was nothing," Martin said, his bravado returning as he descended the stairs to investigate. Clara stayed at the top, the smell too much to bear. "See," Martin called, "just a bunch of junk." His words cut off abruptly. "What is it?" Clara called. No response. Her chest tightened. She leaned over the top step, peering into the gloom. "Martin?" The flashlight flickered, and for a moment she saw him. He was standing in the middle of the room, rigid and unmoving, the beam of light trembling in his hand. He turned to her, his face pale and slack. "There's something down here," he whispered, his voice shaking. "What? What is it?" Before he could answer, the light went out, plunging the basement into total darkness. Clara screamed, and from below she heard him scream too, high-pitched and guttural, the sound of pure terror. Then the door slammed shut. Panicked, she yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Martin!" she cried, pounding on the door. There was no response, just the sound of his scream, which was growing fainter as if being dragged further and further away. Then silence. She called the police. They searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of Martin. The basement, they said, was empty. The dirt floor was undisturbed, as if no one had set foot there in decades. Clara refused to stay in the house. She moved in with her sister, leaving her things behind. Weeks later, the new owners found something strange. The black basement door, which Clara had left unlocked, was sealed again. And when they tried to force it open, they discovered the hinges were gone, replaced with something organic, dark, pulsing flesh that seemed to grow from the frame itself. Rumors say that late at night, if you stand outside the house on Willow Lane, you can hear the faint sound of thumping coming from below. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear a man's voice crying out, begging to be let out, though his screams grow more distant with each passing year. The Peterson house had been empty for years, its windows boarded up and its yard overrun with weeds. The kids in the neighborhood dared each other to peek inside, but no one ever got too close. Everyone knew the story. The last family who lived there left in a hurry, abandoning everything, even their beloved dog. When Rachel moved in, she didn't know the house's reputation. She was just grateful for the cheap rent and a fresh start after her breakup. The landlord was eager to hand over the keys, and though Rachel noticed his nervous glances at the basement door, she didn't ask questions. The house needed work, sure, but she was determined to make it her home. It didn't take long for the unease to settle in. At first, it was small things, a draft she couldn't locate, the way the shadows seemed to pool unnaturally in the corners. And then there was the smell. It was faint at first, like damp soil, but it grew stronger every day until the entire house seemed to reek of wet earth and decay. No matter how much she cleaned, it wouldn't go away. One evening, as she unpacked boxes in the living room, she heard a noise from the basement. A low, muffled scratching, like nails against wood. Rachel froze, her heart pounding. She told herself it was probably mice or maybe a raccoon that had gotten trapped. She decided to ignore it, but the sound came back every night, always around the same time. Scratch, scratch, scratch. On the fourth night, she couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a broom, she opened the basement door. The smell hit her immediately, stronger than ever, nearly making her gag. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended, the light from her flashlight cutting weakly through the darkness. The basement was vast, larger than she expected, with walls of crumbling stone and a dirt floor. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just old shelves and broken furniture. But as she swept the beam of light across the room, something caught her eye. In the far corner, the dirt looked disturbed, as though someone or something had been digging. As she moved closer, her foot hit something solid. She looked down and screamed. It was a bone, yellowed and splintered, sticking up from the earth. Her heart raced as she realized there were more bones scattered around the disturbed patch of dirt, some still partially buried. Human bones. She stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the walls. That's when she saw them. Scratches. Deep, jagged marks gouged into the stone, running in long, frantic lines. Her stomach turned as she realized they weren't from animals. They were from fingers, clawing desperately at the walls. She didn't remember running back upstairs, only that she locked the basement door and shoved a chair under the knob for good measure. She called the police, but when they arrived, the basement was empty. No bones, no scratches, just an ordinary, dusty basement. They left with a warning about prank calls, but Rachel knew what she had seen. That night, she dreamed of the basement. In the dream, she was standing in the corner, staring at the patch of disturbed dirt. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form twisted and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long. Its face was covered in dirt, but its eyes, sunken and milky, stared directly into hers. It opened its mouth, and a sound like the grinding of stone filled the air. When Rachel woke, she was in the basement. Her hands were caked with dirt, her nails cracked and broken as though she had been digging. She scrambled up the stairs, her breath ragged, her mind racing. The chair she had wedged under the knob was undisturbed. The door had been locked from the inside. She fled the house that morning, leaving everything behind. The landlord found her a week later, shaking and hollow-eyed, refusing to speak of what had happened. He didn't press her for details. He had heard similar stories before. The house remains empty now, its basement sealed, but the neighbors still hear scratching at night, and sometimes, if the wind carries just right, they catch a faint whiff of damp earth and decay. They don't talk about it, though, and no one dares to go near. The house on Miller Avenue was a fixer-upper, a sprawling Victorian with peeling paint and an air of neglect. Sarah and Tom had bought it at auction, excited to renovate it into their dream home. What they hadn't realized was that the house came with secrets, dark ones, buried deep in the basement. From the moment they moved in, Sarah felt uneasy. She couldn't put her finger on it, just an inexplicable sense of being watched. The house groaned and creaked like all old houses, but sometimes late at night she heard something different. A faint, rhythmic tapping, almost like knocking, coming from beneath the floorboards. She mentioned it to Tom, but he brushed it off. "Old pipes," he said, waving a dismissive hand. Then there was the basement. They hadn't ventured down there much, but the first time Sarah opened the door, the smell hit her. Damp, sour, and faintly metallic. The single bulb that hung from the ceiling barely illuminated the space, leaving most of it cloaked in shadow. She noticed something strange immediately. A small, locked door set into the far wall, about 3 feet high, with no handle and a keyhole that looked ancient. "Did the realtor say anything about this?" she asked Tom, pointing it out. He shook his head. Probably just a crawl space, he said. But there was something about the door that bothered Sarah. It seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong to the house at all. That night, the noises grew louder. It wasn't just tapping anymore, it was scratching, like nails scraping against wood. Sarah couldn't sleep. She crept downstairs to investigate, her heart pounding. The basement door was closed, but the noises were definitely coming from below. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and descended the stairs, her phone's flashlight slicing through the darkness. The scratching stopped the moment she stepped off the last stair. The basement was silent, oppressively so. She shone her light at the small door. It looked different somehow, the edges warped, as if something had been pushing against it from the other side. She moved closer, her skin prickling with unease. Then she heard it, a whisper. Faint and unintelligible, but unmistakably human. It was coming from behind the door. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Let me out." She stumbled backward, tripping over a pile of debris and scrambling back up the stairs. She slammed the basement door shut and locked it, her hands trembling. "There's someone down there," she gasped, shaking Tom awake. He didn't believe her, of course, but he agreed to check it out the next morning. When they went back down together, the small door was open. The space behind it was a tiny, narrow tunnel, just large enough for a person to crawl through. The walls were lined with claw marks, deep grooves that ran in frantic patterns. At the end of the tunnel was another door, identical to the first and also slightly ajar. "Hell no," Tom muttered, pulling Sarah back. They called the police, who searched the house and found nothing. The officers dismissed the tunnel as part of the house's strange, outdated design. "Probably an old coal chute," one of them said. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, Sarah dreamed of the door. In the dream, she was standing in front of it, unable to move as it slowly creaked open. From the darkness beyond, something crawled out, pale and emaciated, its limbs too long, its face a twisted mass of flesh with no features except for a mouth filled with jagged, broken teeth. It didn't walk. It slithered, its bones cracking as it moved toward her. She woke up screaming, and the sound of scratching filled the air around her, louder than ever. It wasn't coming from the basement this time. It was coming from inside the walls. Tom woke and tried to calm her, but then they both heard it. A voice, faint and raspy, whispering the same words over and over. "Let me out! Let me out!" The next morning they packed their things and left the house, abandoning the renovation entirely. They never returned, and the house has remained empty since. Locals say that at night you can hear the scratching from the street. Some have claimed to see shadows moving behind the windows, long and thin, but when they look closer, the house is still. The door in the basement remains open, and whatever was behind it is still waiting. The old farmhouse had been on the market for years. Perched at the edge of a dense forest, it was the kind of place that felt forgotten by time. When Melissa bought it, she ignored the rumors, the whispers about why no one stayed for long. She just wanted a quiet life, far from the chaos of the city. The first few days were uneventful. Melissa spent her time unpacking, cleaning, and exploring the creaking, spacious home. It wasn't until she found the trapdoor in the pantry that she felt something was off. It was hidden beneath an old rug, a square of heavy wood with an iron ring handle. Curiosity got the better of her. She pulled the rug aside and lifted the trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The smell that wafted up was strange, musty, but with an undercurrent of something sweet and rotten. She wrinkled her nose but grabbed a flashlight and descended. The basement was unlike anything she'd expected. The walls were made of rough stone, the floor uneven dirt. Strange symbols were carved into the stone in places. Circles, jagged lines, and what looked like crude figures. In the center of the room was a well, ringed by crumbling bricks, its darkness seeming to stretch endlessly downward. A cold draft rose from it, carrying with it that sickly, sweet odor. Melissa felt uneasy, but brushed it off as nerves. She climbed back up and resolved to leave the basement alone. But that night, she dreamed of the well. In the dream, she was staring into its depths when something moved, something pale and formless shifting just beyond her sight. A voice whispered her name, soft and insistent, and she woke with a start, her skin clammy with sweat. The next day, strange things began to happen. She found footprints in the dirt outside, leading to the back door, but there were no signs of anyone entering. Objects in the house moved when she wasn't looking. A chair pulled away from the table, a book lying open on a page she hadn't read. She told herself it was her imagination, but the sense of unease grew stronger. Then came the sounds. At first it was faint, a low, almost imperceptible hum coming from the pantry. It grew louder each night, evolving into a soft whispering that seemed to rise from beneath the floor. Melissa tried to ignore it, but sleep became impossible. She started keeping the trapdoor bolted shut. One night, the whispering stopped. Relieved, Melissa managed to drift off, only to wake to the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps. They weren't in the house. They were coming from below. Her heart raced as she stared at the ceiling, listening as the footsteps moved slowly, methodically, across the basement floor. She mustered her courage, grabbing the baseball bat she kept by her bed, and crept toward the pantry. The trapdoor was still bolted shut, but as she approached, the footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then something slammed against the underside of the door, hard enough to rattle the hinges. She screamed and stumbled back as the pounding continued, each hit reverberating through the house. "Let me out!" a voice growled, deep and guttural. Nothing human. "Let me out!" Melissa ran from the house, not stopping until she was in her car, speeding down the empty country road. She never returned, leaving her belongings and the house behind. The farmhouse is still there, abandoned and decaying. Locals say the trapdoor is open now, the well exposed, its black maw yawning in the center of the room. Some claim to hear whispers when they pass by at night, and others say they've seen pale, skeletal hands gripping the edges of the well, clawing at the air as if trying to climb out. No one dares go near the house anymore. They know better. Whatever was in the basement is no longer content to stay below. The Reaver house had always been a mystery in the small town of Clearwater. It stood at the edge of a deep ravine, surrounded by gnarled trees that seemed to twist toward the building like grasping fingers. Its previous owners had vanished one by one, leaving behind only cryptic notes and the echo of their disappearance. When Julie and Mark inherited the property from a distant relative, they saw it as a chance to escape their city life. The house was eerie, sure, but they laughed off the stories. The ravine didn't bother them, the creaking floorboards didn't bother them, but the basement did. The basement door was steel, unlike the rest of the house, and padlocked from the outside. The landlord hadn't mentioned it, and the key wasn't among the set they were given. Julie wanted to call a locksmith to open it immediately, but Mark suggested waiting. "It's probably just a storm shelter," he said. "We'll get to it later." That night, the first strange thing happened. They were unpacking in the living room when they heard a faint noise, a muffled scraping, like nails on metal. It was coming from the basement door. Mark dismissed it as an animal, but Julie couldn't shake the sound. It continued off and on throughout the night, stopping whenever they approached the door. The next morning, Mark pried off the padlock. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase that plunged into darkness. The smell that rose was awful, damp and sharp like rotting wood. Mark flipped the light switch at the top of the stairs, but nothing happened. "The bulb's probably dead," he muttered, grabbing a flashlight. Julie stayed at the top while Mark went down. The beam of light revealed an empty, cavernous space, the walls made of cold, rough stone. There were no windows, no furniture, just the faint outlines of strange markings etched into the walls. As Mark explored, Julie noticed something odd. The air around her had grown colder, and her breath came out in pale puffs. "Find anything?" she called. "No, just some." Mark's voice cut off suddenly. Then she heard it, a loud thud followed by a scraping sound. "Mark?" she yelled, but there was no answer. Her heart pounding, she grabbed her own flashlight and headed down. She found Mark standing in the center of the room, staring at the floor. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Mark, what?" she began, but then she saw it too. In the dirt floor, there was a hole, perfectly round, about 3 feet wide. It hadn't been there before. The edges were smooth, almost unnatural, as though it had been carved by something sharp. And from the hole came a sound, faint whispers, layered and overlapping, like many voices speaking at once. "Let's go," Julie said, grabbing Mark's arm. He nodded, and they hurried up the stairs, slamming the steel door shut behind them. They didn't speak of what they'd seen. That night, the whispers started again. Only this time they weren't faint, they were louder, clearer. They didn't come from the basement. They came from the walls, the floor, the very air. Julie swore she could hear her name being spoken, over and over, in a voice that wasn't Mark's. The next day, they tried to leave, but the car wouldn't start. The battery was dead, and their phones had no signal. Frustrated, Mark decided to take a walk to the nearest neighbor for help. Julie stayed behind, too shaken to leave the house. Hours passed, and Mark didn't return. As the sun set, Julie heard the basement door creak open. She hadn't unbolted it, and she knew Mark hadn't either. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen and crept toward the door. The staircase yawned before her, descending into darkness. "Mark?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. But from the bottom of the stairs came a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming on stone. She descended slowly, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The hole in the floor was larger now, almost 6 feet wide, and from its depths came a sound that froze her blood. A low, guttural breathing, deep and steady, like something massive lying in wait. Then she saw it. A hand. Pale, skeletal, and impossibly long, it gripped the edge of the hole. Another hand followed, and then a face. It wasn't human. Its eyes were empty sockets, its mouth a wide gash that stretched far beyond where it should have stopped. It climbed with a sickening slowness, pulling itself from the darkness below. Julie dropped the flashlight and ran, slamming the basement door and bolting it shut. She didn't sleep that night, sitting with her back to the door, clutching the knife. In the morning, she found Mark's shoes on the porch, but no sign of him. The whispers were everywhere now, louder and more insistent, drowning out her thoughts. She fled the house barefoot, running down the dirt road until she collapsed from exhaustion. Julie was found wandering the highway days later, muttering about the hole and the thing that had crawled out of it. She never returned to the Reaver house, but the whispers didn't leave her. Even now, she says she can hear them, faint and insistent, calling her back to the basement. The house remains empty, but those who pass by swear they've seen something moving in the windows, a long, pale hand brushing the glass before disappearing into the shadows. The house on Black Hollow Road had stood abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and its roof sagging with age, but the basement was untouched, sealed with thick iron bars and a padlock so rusted it looked fused to the door. Local kids dared each other to touch it, but no one ever stayed long enough to go inside. Everyone knew the story. Something had been locked in that basement, and it wasn't meant to be let out. When Sam and Ella moved to town, they didn't believe the stories. They were urban explorers, always seeking out the eerie and forgotten. The house was perfect, a crumbling relic of the past, and its ominous reputation only added to the thrill. They arrived one crisp autumn afternoon, armed with flashlights, cameras, and bolt cutters. The sun cast long shadows over the house as they approached the basement entrance. Sam snapped a photo of the padlock before Ella cut through it with a single satisfying snap. The iron bars groaned as they swung open, revealing a steep staircase descending into blackness. "Ready?" Sam asked with a grin. Ella nodded, her camera already recording. Together, they descended into the basement. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the scent of mildew and something sharper, metallic. Their flashlights illuminated the space, a low-ceilinged room with stone walls, its floor covered in dust. At the far end, a strange structure loomed, a massive iron cage, its bars thick and twisted. It sat in the center of a circle of strange markings etched into the floor, their meaning unclear. "What the hell?" Ella murmured, moving closer. The cage door hung open, its hinges rusted and bent. Inside was nothing but darkness, and yet something about it felt wrong, as if it were waiting. Sam found a diary on a nearby table, its leather cover cracked with age. He flipped it open, the pages filled with spidery handwriting. As he read, his brow furrowed. "It's a journal," he said. "Whoever lived here, they were keeping something down here, something they called the hunger." Ella laughed nervously. "Creepy. What does it say?" Sam skimmed the pages, his voice growing quieter as he read aloud. "They trapped it, something ancient. It feeds on fear and blood. They couldn't kill it, so they locked it up. The markings keep it weak." Ella's camera caught a sudden movement, a flicker of shadow near the cage. "Sam, did you see that?" she whispered. He turned, his flashlight sweeping the room, but there was nothing there, and then the smell hit them. A rank, coppery odor that filled the air, sharp and suffocating. Ella gagged, her flashlight shaking. "We should go," she said, backing toward the stairs. But the shadows seemed to grow, pooling in the corners of the room. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the frigid air. A low sound rose around them, a guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Ella, run!" Sam shouted, grabbing her arm. They bolted for the stairs, but the growl grew louder, turning into a roar. The shadows writhed like living things, and a shape began to emerge from the darkness. Tall and angular, its limbs too long, its eyes glowing faintly red. They scrambled up the stairs, slamming the iron bars shut behind them. The roar echoed in the basement, but the creature didn't follow. It simply stared, its eyes locked on them as they fled into the woods. They never posted the footage from their cameras, never spoke of what they'd seen. But the house on Black Hollow Road is no longer silent. At night, people hear the growling from the basement, low, low and hungry. The iron bars are bent and broken now, as if something forced its way out. Whatever they unleashed is no longer trapped, and it's still hungry. The Turner family's new home seemed perfect. It was a sprawling, two-story farmhouse, secluded at the edge of a quiet town, surrounded by dense woods. For them, it was a dream come true, a fresh start away from the city. They had only one question for the realtor when they bought it. What's with the basement door? The basement door was different from the rest of the house. It was made of thick oak reinforced with iron bands and had 6 heavy-duty locks bolted down its length. The realtor hesitated before replying. The previous owners said it was for safety, she explained vaguely, before quickly changing the subject. The Turners didn't think much of it. People were strange, especially in rural towns, and they figured the locks were just a quirk. They moved in and started settling into their new life. At first, everything was perfect. The kids, Emma and Jake, loved the big backyard and the freedom to explore the nearby woods. Sarah and Greg enjoyed the quiet, the fresh air, and the feeling of space. But the honeymoon phase didn't last long. It started with the noises. Late at night, Sarah would hear faint sounds coming from the basement. At first, she thought it was the old pipes groaning, but the noises became more distinct over time. Soft scratching, like fingernails on wood, followed by faint whispers. She mentioned it to Greg, who joked about rats. He promised to set traps, but never got around to it. One night, Sarah woke to a loud thud. It was coming from the basement. She shook Greg awake, and together they crept downstairs. The house was silent, except for their breathing. The basement door stood at the end of the hall, the locks gleaming in the dim light. Thud. This time, it was louder. Sarah swore she saw the door tremble. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, clutching Greg's arm. Greg nodded, his face pale. "It's probably nothing. Let's check it out in the morning." The noises continued nightly, growing louder, more insistent. One evening, as the family sat in the living room, Emma asked, "Who's the man in the basement?" The room fell silent. Sarah and Greg exchanged a glance. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Sarah asked carefully. Emma pointed toward the basement door. "I saw him last night. He was looking at me from the crack under the door. He had red eyes." Greg tried to laugh it off, but Sarah couldn't shake the chill that ran down her spine. She insisted they open the basement and investigate. The next day, Greg gathered his tools and removed the locks one by one. Each came off with a heavy clang that echoed through the house. When the final lock fell away, he hesitated. "Are we sure about this?" he asked. Sarah nodded, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "We need to know." Greg opened the door, and the stench hit them immediately. Rotten, damp, and metallic. He flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. Armed with flashlights, they descended the narrow stairs. The basement was vast, much larger than they had expected. The air was frigid, and the stone walls were slick with moisture. At first, they saw nothing but old furniture and cobwebs. Then Sarah noticed something strange. Claw marks on the walls, deep gouges that ran from the floor to the ceiling. In the center of the room was a trapdoor, its edges stained dark brown. Greg knelt to examine it, but before he could touch it, the door slammed shut upstairs. The sound reverberated through the basement, and suddenly the air was filled with a deep, guttural growling. "Let's get out of here." "Here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. Greg didn't argue. As they climbed the stairs, the growling grew louder, and the basement seemed to grow darker. The trapdoor behind them creaked open, and they heard something heavy dragging itself across the floor. They reached the top just as a loud bang shook the basement door. Greg quickly replaced the locks, his hands trembling. They didn't speak about what they'd seen, but that night, none of them slept. The noises didn't stop. If anything, they became worse. Scratching, banging, and whispers echoed through the house at all hours. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision. Emma started sleepwalking, waking up at the foot of the basement stairs with no memory of how she got there. One night, Sarah woke to find the bed empty. Greg was gone. She found him standing at the basement door, his hand on the locks. "Greg," she whispered. He turned to her, his eyes vacant, his face slack. "It's calling me," he said, his voice hollow. She pulled him away, slamming the door shut as the whispers grew louder, now frantic and pleading. That was the last night they spent in the house. The Turners left everything behind. The house remains abandoned, its basement door still locked tight. Locals say that at night you can hear banging and growling from within, and some claim to see glowing red eyes staring from the cracks. No one stays long on Black Hollow Road, but the locks, they don't seem to hold forever.